Welcome to Balabatish Questions, a 4-part series from Shtark Tank. Shtark Tank is a podcast about the challenges and opportunities of being a Ben Torah in the workforce. Over the past 14 episodes, we spoke with 14 incredible individuals about their journey to live a broad life, incorporating Torah, work, and other responsibilities. There are so many more role models that I plan on interviewing, but I wanted to dig even deeper to touch on some core issues that can't really be tackled in the interview format. These fundamental issues are about the mindset, motivation, and mentality of being a Ben Torah in the workforce. The goal here is to be a conversation starter, not to give any neat solutions or decisive answers. I have been thinking about these issues a lot, but I don't want to be disconnected from reality. At the end of the day, I have been in Kollel for the past 7 years and have never had a full-time job. So I sat down with Zevi Reinitz, a tech and marketing executive who is also a Mechaber Sfarim, to have a recorded chavrusa on some of these issues. Zevi was the inaugural guest on Shtark Tank, and you can check out our interview in the feed. He has experienced these issues firsthand, so I was excited to have him on as a co-host. We had a 4-part conversation, and these sections will be dropping in the feed over the next 2 weeks, on Mondays and Wednesdays. I hope that everyone scrubbing, running errands, and traveling over the next 2 weeks finds these conversations informative, insightful, and illuminating. Thank you so much to the Ian Institute for sponsoring this series. Are you looking for hard-hitting analysis of the Haredi draft controversy and other issues that Haredi society is grappling with? Make sure to check out the Ian Institute. You can subscribe to their newsletter and check out their fascinating new podcast at the links in the show notes. I am a bit scared about releasing this first episode. We talk about the yeshiva system that many of us went through and shine a light on certain things that can pose a significant challenge for Balabatim. During my years in yeshiva, I heard things from Rebbeim who I absolutely revere, whose levels of Torah and Yiras Shamayim is way beyond anything I will ever achieve. But in the end of the day, I can't shake the feeling that some of the things I heard are irrelevant, unhelpful, or not practical. For listeners who don't know, I am nearing the end of my time in Kollel. And as I take stock and think about what lies ahead, I have found myself revisiting some of the ideas I heard about yeshiva, the world outside yeshiva, and the Mitzvah of Talmud Torah, and really struggling with them. I have utmost appreciation and respect for these rebbeim, the yeshivas, and the whole system. But for me, the time has come to reckon with some of these Balabatish questions. My name is Yaakov Wolff, and this is Shtark Tank. Okay, we're coming to you from Yerushalayim, Yer Kodesh. I'm here with Zevi Reinitz, who Shtark Tank listeners will remember from the very first episode of Shtark Tank. Welcome, Zevi. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Yaakov.
So we're going to try something new in the Shtark Tank world. We're going to try to have a co-hosted conversation about meaning, identity, motivation, aspirations of being a Ben Torah, being a working person, being a Jew in 2024. And we're going to try to talk about some of the basic fundamental topics that come up with regards to the mindset, with regards to the hashkafa, with regards to the attitude that we have towards living life as a Ben Torah. And I want to start with 2 stories that happened to me when I was in Shana Aleph. They actually started very, very quick into my yeshiva career. Actually, the very first morning, the very first shachris, we finished davening, and the mashkiach, Rav Rivlin, got up to review the yeshiva rules for those who are coming back, for the new students. And he said, there's a Balabatish minhag to drink coffee while you're learning. And we're in yeshiva, we don't have coffee in the Batei Midrash. And he said the word Balabatish with a bit of a derisive tone, not too bad, but I quickly learned that in the Batei Midrash, probably the worst insult that you could hurl at your chavrusa is to say, that was a Balabatish svara. Or if the Rebbe says that to you in the middle of Shir, you're in big trouble. So that was the first sort of story. And I give a lot of credit to my good friend Shlomi Eichler, who on that very first morning, on the walk from the Keren B'Yavneh Batei Midrash to the Cheder Ochel, which is not a long walk, he came over to me and said, I don't get it. My dad, he works hard. He's a lawyer. He does his thing. He tries his best to learn Daf Yomi. So why are you knocking on Balabatim? That was his comment. And that interaction stuck with me for a very long time. On the other end of the spectrum, there was another thing which I heard from one of my Rebbeim, Rav Gazi. And he said very clearly, he said, look, you guys, we have goals for every single one in this Batei Midrash. And that goal is to be a Talmid Chacham. And a Talmid Chacham could be a lawyer, a doctor, an accountant, or a Rav, but every single person in the Batei Midrash has the same goal, the same aspiration, and every single one is supposed to be a Talmid Chacham regardless of their professional identity. So those two polar opposites or two poles of the spectrum are what I want to talk about today, trying to think about the question of identity, the question of what it means to be a Bahlabus, to be a Talmid Chacham. And the question of identity is a very, very important one. I just want to point out there's a great book called Indistractable by a guy named Nir Eyal. And he talks about being focused in a distracted world. And he says, look, there are a lot of tips and strategies that I can give you to help you be more focused. But in the end of the day, the most important thing is to cultivate a sense of identity. Identity drives behavior, identity drives self-confidence, and identity drives social expectations. So in his context, he was saying if you develop an identity of being indistractable, and that will help you be indistractable. So too here, the question of identity. Do we view Bahlabus as a slur, as a sort of derisive term, or do we have another sense of identity which creates a little more pride and confidence in our abilities in Torah? That's the question that we're here to deal with today.
Yeah, I think it's such a important point, and I think you really hit it on the head with that story, because I think that anybody who's been in certainly the call it the American yeshiva world or whatever, where you have this tension between people who are very serious about their learning and have developed skills over years and really want to make that part of their lives, and then they also either go back to college or wherever they end up and they want to develop some sort of professional career. I think that there's always this tension that people feel to some degree at some point in their life of how do I balance? Is this what I should be doing? Am I living a lechatchila life or a b'diavad life? However you say it to yourself. And I just think that this is something which maybe without intending to do so, our system has kind of given us a tension that we have to struggle with, maybe more than we should. And I think I love what you're saying about Nir Eyal and framing. And I think one of the important things about these conversations and the conversations that you and I are having, Yaakov, but also hopefully conversations that people can start having even beyond the context of this show or this podcast, is that, your identity doesn't always have to be, you can reframe your identity. Identity is not something which is fixed. And it's like, okay, we like to attach identity sometimes to the end result, what it is that we are. I am a plumber. I am a doctor. I am a Rebbe. I am a Rosh Yeshiva. And while certainly that's part of it, I think that both in the context of Torah and also outside the context of Torah, we have an opportunity to reframe our identities to things which are more foundational, more fundamental. And that's what you alluded to, or your Rev Al-Ghazi, I think you referenced that. You can be someone who's just in love with Torah and someone who has a strong relationship with Hashem and somebody who is a Torah Jew, and you are also a doctor, and you are also a proud lawyer, things like that. So it's about reframing and feeling confident in terms of how we're living our lives, and not always having to feel like we're having this implicit apologetic sense of walking around. I think that's really the goal here, is to just be less apologetic about the way we're living our lives as Torah Jews. Right,
and the professional question is a great one, and I think that's a topic for another day, but a lot to talk about there as far as how the great question, so what do you do, is a whole another topic to be unpacked, but we're going to leave that for another day.
And I just want to say, just to make it, on that note, just to be brutally honest and vulnerable, I think that I can speak for myself, but I don't think I'm the only one. I think that question engenders a lot of almost like mild anxiety in the moment for people. It's like you're proud of yourself as a Torah Jew, whatever you do professionally. If somebody asks you what is it you're doing, people can get nervous about that. It's like, well, am I answering the right way? Are they going to think of me? Anyway, but I just want to put that out there. It's a real thing, and people should be okay confronting that.
Right. So we'll have to do another series on that at some point as well. So what we're going to try to do to start off is to really tackle three questions. The first, as far as this question of identity and Bahlabus, try to talk about some of the sources, the Mar Makomos, is the Samachlokes. How do we approach that from a Torah perspective? The second thing is some of the cultural and historical background. I think it's important to understand why it is that Bahlabus has become sort of a slur or a derisive term in certain Batei Midrash. Number two. The third thing is, what are the practical implications when we take some of these broader intellectual topics and we actually take them into the real world? What do they look like, and what are some of the implications? So those are the three buckets that we're going to start with. So we'll start with some Mar Makomos. I think in the first place to look at when we talk about learning Torah is the Rambam's Hilchos Talmud Torah, which is a very fundamental text. And the Rambam is super, super clear in Hilchos Talmud Torah that Torah is for everybody. In fact, he's so clear about it, he's too clear. The Mefarshim are actually bothered why the Rambam spends 3 halachos in the very first parak of Hilchos Talmud Torah really just saying the same thing. Talmud Torah is for everyone. He doesn't say that by tzitzis or by tefillin. It's a mitzvah for every Jewish man. That's it. But the Rambam in Parak Aleph Halacha Ches says, Kol ish miYisrael chayev Talmud Torah bein ani bein ashir, bein shalom begufo bein bal yisurim, bein bachor bein shaya zaken gadol shetashash kocho. So even if you're rich or even if you're poor. And then he goes on to the biggest kicker, which I appreciate because my kids are up in all hours of the night. That's the icing on the cake. And then he goes on into halacha tes. Gedolei chachmei Yisrael hayu mehem chot ve'itzim umehem shovei mayim umehem sumim va'afal pichen hayu oskim b'Talmud Torah bayom u'balayla v'hei mechal matikya shmua ish mipi Moshe Rabbeinu. And then halacha yud, which I find to be the strangest one or the craziest one, he asked the question, Ad emasai chayav l'Talmud Torah? Answer is, Ad yom moso shene'amar ufen yasur milvavcha kol yamei chayecha v'kol zman shelo yasok bolimud hu shocheach. So again, without going into what all the Mefarshim try to struggle, like the Rambam, who's usually so precise and so concise and so to the point with his formulations, why is he going on 3 halachos basically saying the same thing? No matter who you are, no matter what your situation is, you're supposed to learn. So again, I don't even want to go into all the Mefarshim, but I think the very basic message is Talmud Torah is for everyone. Now, the Rambam does admit that there is an elite level of Talmud Torah. And there you have to go to Parak Gimel of Hilchos Talmud Torah, where he introduces this concept called Keser Torah, the crown of Torah. And there's a very beautiful essay by Rav Soloveitchik, written he gave it as a Yartzeit Shir, Shir Zechar Abba Mori, about Birchas HaTorah. And he has a very beautiful description of what Keser Torah means. He describes it as a certain internal royalty that a person gains through Talmud Torah, a certain kedusha, a certain special personality trait, a certain special aura that surrounds a person who's osik in Talmud Torah. And again, here the Rambam is also very clear that the elite level of Keser Torah is not for specific individuals, it's for everyone. He says that the third Keser is Keser Torah, Hari Munach ve'omei dumuchan lakolam, in Parak Gimel halacha aleph Hilchos Talmud Torah. Shene'amar, Ma'or Kilas Yaakov, Kol Mish Yirtzeh, Yevo V'yito. And then he says that Keser Torah is the best Keter, better than Keser Kahuna, better than Keser Malchus. So that's the first point that the Rambam makes about Keser Torah. The next thing he says is that, just like he said in Parak Aleph, that he talks about working as part and parcel of this life. So in Parak Gimel, he does it as well. Parak Gimel halacha Yud and halacha Yud Aleph, he says, Kol hamesim alibo sheyasik b'Torah v'lo yasem malacha v'yisparnish min hatzdaka harei ze chil las Hashem ubiza es haTorah v'chiba me'or hadas v'garm ra la'atzmo v'notel chayiv min olam haba l'fi she'asur lehenos min divrei Torah b'olam hazeh. And then he goes on, Talach Yid Aleph, Ma'ala Gedola, L'misha Misparnis, Ma'asa Yadav, U'midas Chasidim, Arishonim Hi, U'bezeh Zoch L'kol Kavod V'tova Sheba'olam Hazeh. So too here, working is not a bug, it's not a obstacle, it's a feature of the life of being Zoch Keter Torah is working. So that's the second thing that the Rambam says. Now, what is Talmud Torah? What is Keser Torah? How does a person achieve it? So the Rambam is not 100% super clear, but the picture that he draws at various points in Parak Gimel is that it's not about being a genius. It's not about being rich. It's not about being super intense. It's about Torah being the most important thing in your life. I think the most important halacha in this regard is actually halacha Vav, which says as follows: Mi shenis'o libo l'kayim mitzvah zu karo'ila v'lios muchtar b'kitra shel Torah lo yasiach dato l'dvarim acherim. Now the Rambam, as we said, he makes clear that he doesn't mean to not work. He just means that the most important thing on your priority list is supposed to be your Torah. Don't try to have multiple priorities and multiple goals and aspirations. So he's clear that it's not about being smart. It's not about being intense. It's not about working. It's not about not working at all and learning 28 hours a day. It's about Torah being the most important thing. That you only can have one thing at the top of your agenda, and that is Torah. So this is, I think, the most important frame, most important setup, which is that we could talk about other Ma'amar Komos. We could talk about the Rambam, famous Rambam in the end of Hilchos Shmita of Yovel, where he does distinguish between Shevet Levi and other Shvatim, but the very basic test is the Rambam. The very basic text is Hilchos Talmud Torah, and in Parak Aleph he's super clear. Torah is for everyone, and Parak Gimel he's super clear. Keter Torah is accessible to anybody, and that is the very basic foundation which I think we should all be keeping in mind and working with when we think about the distinction that people want to make between various types of Bnei Torah.
Yeah, so this is a really important place to start. I agree with you. The Rambam's always a great place to start. I think also because he's just such a systematic, clear presenter of Divrei Halacha and Divrei Hashkafa. Sometimes together, it's a great place to start. One, micro rant, if I may, just in terms of the way that we as Jews, I guess, the way that we relate to some of these sources. I think that a lot of times, we can read a Gemara, we could read a Rambam, and they're saying something so profound, but I'm not sure exactly what it is. Maybe it's because we work hard to, on the text and the understanding, and, we have like our yeshivish way of saying things and our terminology. We could read a really profound thing where, let's say, if we were to open up some sort of business book or psychology book from outside of the Jewish world, and we would read a really profound insight, we would say, wow, that's amazing, that's applicable to my life. But sometimes you can then hear the same kernel of an idea that's framed as a, in Hebrew or with a pasuk or from a Gemara, and we don't necessarily connect those dots. We don't necessarily translate it all the way back to ourselves in a practical way. And so I think, people know this Rambam, they've read this Rambam, they're aware of it. They don't necessarily connect some of the profundity of what the Rambam says with the eventual tension and struggle that they might feel in their own real lives about, Bahlabus and working and learning. And so I think, that's what I'm trying to think about when I think about this Rambam, and maybe just a couple of quick reflections of what I see in this Rambam, what's significant for me, because I think you're right. I think the first and foremost, the most powerful thing I see in this Rambam, and reading through all of the halachos that you mentioned, both Perek Aleph and Perek Gimel that you referenced of the Kesher Torah, if I had to sum it up in one kind of theme, to me, the Rambam is yelling from the rooftops that Torah is not a one-dimensional linear process, right? It's not a checklist or a degree or something that you get that you wave around and show your grandmother. Of course, there's aspects of that, and you can get smicha and show your parents and get, everybody's proud of you, and you might need a certain technical degree, in order to be a moreh hora'ah or some sort of posek. Of course, there's a technical side of things. But as it comes to us as individuals, as Torah Jews, I think the Rambam is suggesting and insisting that we need to look at it as a three-dimensional relationship. Our goal, I think, is to develop a very complex, nuanced relationship with Torah. And starting from the beginning of, the first halacha that you referenced, I think that that's what the Rambam's telling us there. Kol ish me'Yisrael chayav b'Talmud Torah. An interesting question that the Mefarshim asked, just to zoom in on this one line, the Rambam repeats himself even within this halacha. The Rambam says everybody's required to study Torah. And then the Rambam starts giving us specific examples. Bein ani, bein ashir, bein shalem begu. Why do you have to repeat yourself? One second. If you told me every single person has to do this, why do you then immediately have to tell me even the rich guy, even the poor guy, even the person, even the parent? And it's the Rambam, who is like, all the Rishonim, but the Rambam who's famous for his brevity and his clarity, what is he doing? And I always thought that maybe what the Rambam here is trying to say is kind of what I was suggesting before, that every single person has an obligation to be connected to the Torah. And you might think that if you looked around the room, every single person has their tension and their challenges. A person who, God forbid, is in the hospital and can't learn, from a real sefer, or can't, he's falling asleep half the time, or he's in pain. He has his challenges in terms of learning. In terms of, the person who has a family and has family obligations, it's another challenge. A person who has learning disabilities or some other issue that they're struggling with, or he's poor and has to go beg, God forbid, that's another set of challenges. So a person who doesn't know what Torah is can look around and see each person learning, and they could say, well, that doesn't look like the same mitzvah. The way that I'm Mekayim the Mitzvah of Talmud Torah might not look like the way that you're Mekayim the mitzvah, because my limitations and opportunities and kohos are different and yours are different. And what the Rambam here is trying to stress is that it doesn't make a difference what the situation is. Everybody has a situation. It's not a linear process. It's not a parallel process. Every person has to develop their own relationship with Torah. Just because the tzura of the kiyum of the mitzvah looks different between people, it doesn't mean that I'm less chayav. It doesn't mean that I'm less shayach. It doesn't mean that I'm less capable. And I think that that's what the Rambam is trying to stress, and that leads into the Kesher Torah as well, is that the person, as you stressed, the Kesher Torah is something which every individual has an opportunity to tap into, no matter where they are, working, learning, doesn't make a difference, but it's also not necessarily an obligation. So there's a complexity in a relationship, just like in any human relationship. You can have a relationship with a spouse or with a best friend that is, on the one hand, sometimes is jovial and light, and sometimes is very intense and intimate, and sometimes is happy, and sometimes is sad. It's just the nature of any good, healthy relationship, is you have a complexity and a nuance to it. And I think that that's, in broad strokes, what the Rambam is stressing here is that it's not a linear process, and it's not something which, our identity is not tied to one specific outcome or one specific way of doing things.
Right. And I think, as you mentioned, this really brings us into the next section of our conversation, which is that it's clear, anyone who goes out and looks in the world, that what you're saying is true, that Torah has this complexity, and there are way more than Shivan Panim, but Shivan Panim just as a mashal to show how much variety and diversity there could be within the world of Torah, and especially stemming from, as you mentioned, the different situations, the different backgrounds, the different interests, the different challenges that each and every person faces. And so then the question becomes, so then where do we get this more polarized view of things, the more black and white, constrained, narrow, limited view of Torah? And as we said before, like the system that we grew up in, the yeshiva system, does express this in various ways and forms, and that's what I started with the mashgiach, who says that there's yeshiva bachar and then there's a Bahlabus, and there's a very clear black and white distinction there. And I think that, just to go into the second question that we asked the second question, so where did this come from? Where did this narrow, constrained approach come from? And I think it makes a lot of sense when you think about the yeshiva world that we live in as a result of the efforts to rebuild the Torah world after the Holocaust. So, back then you really needed to form a very simple sense of identity and bring people to yeshiva and keep them in yeshiva as much as possible. So one of the things I think about a lot is I grew up in a home that was influenced greatly by Rav Chaim Yaakov Wolff, Zechrono Livracha, the founding Rosh Yeshiva of Kerem B'Yavneh, and he always called yeshiva a tevas noach. Now, that makes a lot of sense. It's a crazy world out there. Yeshiva is a simple, you sit down, you learn, your food is served to you, your bed is a few feet away, you don't have to work, you don't have to deal with kids. So it's certainly true on some level, and it certainly makes sense to attract people to come yeshiva and stay in yeshiva by telling them, when you're here, you're in tevas noach. When you're outside, you're in the mabel. But for everyone else who has to actually go out into the world, so where does that leave them? I'm going out into a mabel. So again, if we're talking about Rav Goldvich starting Kerem B'Yavneh 70 years ago, and it's in the wake of the Holocaust, so I understand that need. But for everyone else, now that we've not for everyone else, but moving forward in history to a different place where the yeshiva world is very, very strong, very, very robust, Baruch Hashem. So I think a different discourse is a lot more helpful in this regard. So, for example, Rav Moshe Taragin at Yeshivat Har Etzion, he talks a lot about yeshiva as a lighthouse, where we're not talking about this is the only haven that you have from the terrors of the outside world. It's that this is where, as a young person, you chart your path because you have a special sense of vision and clarity when you're young and when you don't have all the stresses of outside life. So you chart a path, and then in the stormy waters, you have the path that you were able to chart from the lighthouse that takes you through. So I think that's a much more helpful way of viewing things in our world, where even people are going to be machanechem, so no one stays in yeshiva forever. So what is a machanech also in the mabel? So that frame, I think, is b'mchila michvod Goldvich. I think it was very, very helpful for when he was starting Kerem B'Yavneh. But I think nowadays it's not so helpful. It's not so useful. I think a different way of thinking about yeshiva versus Bahlabus is a lot more practical, a lot more helpful, and a lot more relevant in 2024.
So I just want to zoom in and focus on the last couple of words that you said, because you used the word practical and useful, and I think that's a really, really important point to drill down on, is that you can philosophize and bring makoros, and you can say this or that, and I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I think that there is a time and a place, and times do change, and the community realities and the realities on the ground in terms of Jewish history, they change. Going back from the shtetl, where everybody had their kind of positions, and it was just kind of, I assume, based on what I read and understand, nobody really, there was the Rav, and there was the guy the butcher and the baker, and people just did their thing, and it was okay. And you go to the Rav with your chicken, and you make sure it's a kosher. So obviously, I agree with a lot of that, but I think at the end of the day, we sometimes spend too much time worrying about the philosophy of it and the psychology of it. And I think at the end of the day, we're wasting a lot of collective time, focusing too much on trying to navigate, is this the right approach? Is this not the right approach? When at the end of the day, it's you could just ask yourself a more practical question. Is this way of looking at it serving me? am I learning more Torah as a result of looking at myself as Sugbet? If I'm an institution and a student, is this enabling and empowering my students to learn more Torah? By saying that they're, by frowning at them because they're going to college or because they're getting a career? Or do I have an opportunity to exponentially increase the amount of Torah and enthusiasm and quality of Torah that they're going to learn by empowering them and encouraging them and giving them the broad guidance of like becoming a Ben Torah without worrying about what that exact output looks like? And again, if you look at Chazal, I remember one time years ago, somebody sent me a picture of a ad that was published by, I'm not even sure, it doesn't make a difference which Jewish organization had published it, but somebody had, maybe it was a Purim Spiel, I don't know. It was basically a Yellow Pages, for anybody who remembers what the Yellow Pages are, the phone book, where you would look up in the old days before Google and find your business owner, so I need a plumber and I need this and I need that. I'm looking for an exterminator in New Jersey. And it was basically set up by profession, but instead of having, John Smith, it was different Tanaim and Amoraim. And it was their profession. And this one was, and Rishonim and Achronim, people who famously had different, and the Gemara talks about it, different careers, different businesses. And somebody had said to me, they sent it with a caption of, you see, even the Tanaim worked, even they felt it was important to get a parnasa, and even they felt like it was important to. And in other words, as if to say that, like, everybody should be focusing on their career and career development and things like that. And my response to him, and after you mentioned the Rambam, I'm looking back, this seems to be what the Rambam was paraphrasing also, is I said, well, you could also look at it the other way. You could say that, no, they were working and learning and taking themselves seriously, and in professional context, and they were also still able to be the Matik Yashmua. They were still also able to be. In other words, you can look at yourself. You can disconnect between the two, and you can look at yourself and not focus so much on worrying about, oh, I'm just the plumber, oh, I'm just the winemaker or whatever it is. You can do those things and do those things well, and then disconnect and still be able to just say, and I just want to find ways to be successful and learn Torah at a high level, and not let the two things affect each other. And I think that's just important, is to just focus on what's useful, focus on what's practical. I think that's a healthy kind of reframing, also for people on a practical level.
Yeah, and I think just tying together what you just said with another earlier comment that you made, you just said, you have to think about today, what's serving you, what mindset is good for you and helpful for you. You spoke before about the fact that your identity is something which you can and should rethink at different points in your life. And just to pick up on that, I think that one of the dangers here is that yeshiva is a very special time, but it's also a very formative time where we're transitioning into adulthood, we're developing a hashkafas olam, and therefore we're very, very impressionable at that time. And it could be that these comments that we hear in yeshiva as 18, 19-year-olds can really get stuck very deep in our persona and very deep in our psyche. So I think it's important to have these conversations, that anyone listening to this, whether they're in their 20s, in their 30s or 40s, just to stop and think for a second about what the mindsets that have influenced and are driving them, and maybe it's time to move on. Like, just to add one more point, is that I'm the last person, I really, just be very clear, I in no way criticizing any of these, Talmidei Chachamim who are miles greater than I am. They all have their own reasons for what they're doing. I just think that it's very important for anyone who's listening to this and they're in the workforce and they want to develop a Torah life, to really just think hard about what things they heard in yeshiva are useful, as you said, and are relevant and are practical, and what things, maybe we should be, letting go of, so to speak, and working hard to develop an alternative identity, which is more practical, more relevant, and more inspiring, and helps them succeed more, versus some of the things they may have heard when they were very impressionable and very young.
Yeah, and that's going to be true of anything. You're going to any kind of issue that you're trying to tackle in the Torah context and business context and philosophy, psychology. You're always going to have multiple approaches. There's always going to be different philosophies and approaches, and I think that very often, we get stuck sometimes in one approach, or getting nervous about this or about that, but there is there is an advantage, and there is a real toelis in just saying sometimes that, just to again echo this point that you're making, I think very clearly, you need to find the approach that serves you. What am I trying to achieve at the end of the day? Am I trying to make everybody else happy and impress everybody that I'm so successful in whatever I'm trying to be successful at? Or am I trying to just be a Ben Torah? Or am I trying to be a great parent? Am I trying to be a happy, healthy Jewish person who's growing and succeeding? And if that's the goal, which really is, I think everybody's goal is that, then the question is what is the approach? What is the inputs that are going to lead to that output? And I think you also said something which was spot on, is that different periods require different focus and different frames. So in yeshiva, absolutely, be all in, do it. You're in law school, be in law school, and lahavdil. Like if you're studying for the LSATs, you want to study for the LSATs. You don't want that to be a half-baked thing. You want to get in. You want to continue to move. But as you progress, you need to be able to frame to adapt to the situations that evolve.
So the last thing on this topic that we're going to talk about, which is these two approaches really reflect themselves sometimes in the style of learning and the style of teaching in different yeshivas. So just for example, there are two tremendous Talmidei Chachamim who one of them is a Rebbe of mine, one of them is not, and I don't want to mention them by name just because I didn't speak about them. I didn't speak with them about this beforehand. Who they have very, very intense shiurim. They require their students to prepare a lot, to review a lot, just to understand what's going on. And that's all well and good, as you said, during yeshiva. But some of these Rebbeim, what they'll also do is they'll basically say, this is the way to learn. And anything else, well, if they're diplomatic, they'll say it's half-baked or it's fluff. Or if they're a little sharper, they might say, like, you don't make Berachas Torah on that stuff, do you? So this also is a reflection of the same tension, which is that if you view the yeshiva learning as the only way to learn, so what are you setting up your Talmidim for? So I think the answer, it's not a cynical question, it's a high-risk, high-reward situation. If you're able to go on from yeshiva, be a Bahlabus, and really push yourself to maintain that sort of level of intensity in iyun and learning and focus and dedication, so that's great. If a person's able to do that, that's wonderful. But again, it's very high risk. Most people look outside are not able to do that. Whereas others say, and I think Rav Aaron Lopiansky in the Sefer Ben Torah for Life takes this approach, saying, no. There's a style of learning which is good for yeshiva, and that builds you up, it builds your muscles, it starts you on your path. But maybe when you're a Bahlabus and you're working and your time and energies are a little more limited, so there are other portions of Torah. There's stuff like Agadata and Mishnah Berurah and other things that are just as much a part of Talmud Torah as the iyun and yeshiva, but different limudim are good for different points in life, and those just can live in a very beautiful synergy and harmony and synthesis with each other. So I think the two approaches that we laid out in the very beginning between Bahlabus as like this derisive identity versus Talmud Chacham, a smooth transition from yeshiva identity to post-yeshiva to working, can also represent themselves sometimes in the way the Rebbeim give their shiur and talk about the Mitzvah of Talmud Torah. And I think this will transition to the next conversation that we have, which is about how hard we push ourselves, how intense we are, how much we demand of ourselves, and how we think about our accomplishments and our successes and our failures and learning. All really just coming from that same tension of how do we view the Mitzvah of Talmud Torah, how do we view our system where we start out in yeshiva and then we transition to life in the working world as well.
Yeah, so I have a couple things I just want to mention about style of learning and iyun and bekius or whatever different things. Just a couple of quick points of reflection. Number one, and maybe this is controversial to say, I don't know, but I think that we as a system oversimplify it. I think that this whole notion of there is this way of learning and there is this way of learning and this way of learning, and then you're either learning be'iyun or bekius or whatever. I think that is a overly simplistic and way of looking at the way of engaging with Torah. Just to a quick vignette, I learned one of the yeshivas I learned in was with my Rebbe Rav Chaim Ilson, who was a student of Rav Soloveitchik, and he's well known for his lumdis and his iyun and his real heavy analysis of texts and things like that. The boys back in yeshiva, we used to love to hack around and like ask him, derech halimud, and back in the day there was like a big talk in the Rav's derech halimud and what's the real brisker derech and whatever, all these terms that we all throw out. And I remember once him saying, he would usually just like dismiss the question and be like, I don't know, I want to let's just learn instead of talking about learning. But there was one time where I recall that he actually addressed this, and he said something which was so simple and for me was just so profound, where he said, you really want to know my derech halimud? You really want to know what the derech halimud is? My derech halimud can be summed up as like 3 words: read and think. Read what you're learning, think about what it says. And I think that really is what iyun is. You're reading critically, you're thinking critically, you're amassing knowledge from other places and being able to compare, davar, lahavin davar mitoch davar and things like that, and compare different makoros. That's what iyun is. Iyun doesn't have to mean I'm learning 10 rishonim and my whole this and that, and I'm learning this sugya as opposed to this sugya. When a person has a relationship, a high quality relationship with Torah, you could have the simplest Rashi and Chumash, or the sugya of Takva Kohen. It doesn't make a difference what you're learning. You're learning everything be'iyun because you're reading and thinking critically. And I think that that's the main thing that I would focus on. Or if it was up to me, I would emphasize that nuance, which is you want to teach people who are going through the yeshiva system to be able to learn be'iyun, not because they're going to write their own 10-volume set of Chidushay Torah. Great if that's what you want to do. But the real thing is to empower them to be able to read and think critically, no matter what they're learning. Again, it could be anything, because that's really what the experience of Torah has to be. And I think one other quick story from my yeshiva days, which is that another Rebbe of mine once said that he has different dapim and shas for different days. He didn't mean specific numbers for specific things. He says, you have the way of learning a daf where you're stressed and frazzled and distracted, and you're just grinding through it, and you might even not look at Rashi that day. And then you have another daf and shas where you're all in and you have a great chavrusa and you're writing a sefer, I don't know what, and you're all. He says Torah, and he said the same thing about his davening. He has different Shmon Esreis. I have a Shmon Esrei for 25-minute quick minyan, and I have my 45-minute and my Yom Kippur Shmon Esrei. You need to have a toolkit in davening and avodas Hashem and learning that reflects the realities on the ground, and I think that's important to build that well-rounded skill set. And finally, Rav Shechter, I remember once telling me, I asked him this question also. I said, what should I focus on? Should I just learn Shas 100 times and just go through it quickly? Should I learn Be'iyun? Should I study Shulchan Aruch? And he kind of shrugged his shoulders. He's like, you gotta learn everything, man. It's like it's all Torah. I'm not gonna. It's priorities. You want to talk about specific situations? That's a fair question. But at the end of the day, we just have to do as much as we can. We're connected. It's like how much should I love my kid? How much should I speak to my wife? How much? What does it mean? It's an endless opportunistic relationship. I mean, just you want to just connect with that relationship as much as you possibly can. There's no end. There's certain guidelines. There's a healthy, not healthy. You can talk about it in those terms. But there's no limitations. There's no actual guidelines, and I think that that's maybe a healthier reframing of how to look at this stuff. It's not EU and Bakiyas that just read and think.
Right. I think just to summarize, we touched on a lot of really important points. Is that all these complexities and all these nuances and all these various colors and dimensions of Talmud Torah and of our ability to engage in Talmud Torah at different points and different styles at different energy levels of our lives, those should all be folded into that identity that we started with, the identity of whoever you are, wherever you are listening to this, thinking about whatever cards you have in your deck at the moment. So that should really be your l'chatchila identity. And I think just to reference back to Rav Breitowitz, who in our Shtark Tank episode with him really talked about this point, which is that wherever you are right now, you have to think, Ma Hashem Elokecha rotzeh me'imach. What does he want from you? And that should be your identity. And if you're not sure about it, just open up the Rambam in Hilchos Talmud Torah, as we said, Bein Ani, Bein Ashir, Bein Shalom Begufo, Bein Bal Yisurim. Torah is for everyone. The Kesser Torah is Munach HaKol for everyone. So I hope everyone listening to this can be able to start having these conversations and really thinking about their identity as being a L'chatchila, Ben Torah, Kesser Torah Jew, no matter what their situation is.
Agreed. Completely. Well said.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Shtark Tank. Please make sure to leave a 5-star review and hit that subscribe button. It really helps us grow the show. Until next time, keep on steiging, Chevra.